The beach was wrong. Chintan knew it the moment he opened his eyes. The sea was almost glassy now, barely a ripple, as if the storm that had just torn a 500-person cruise ship apart had taken place somewhere else entirely, and left no evidence here. He lay face down in wet sand, coughing salt water, and looked in both directions along the shore. No lifeboats, no luggage, no bodies. A ship had sunk, somewhere near here, no more than an hour ago. The water should have been scattered with debris, foam seat cushions, plastic bottles, those bright orange life rings bolted to every deck railing. There was nothing, just white sand, a dense wall of jungle, and a horizon that looked like it had never seen a vessel at all. He sat up slowly, ribs aching. His shoes were somewhere in the ocean. Then a sound, not from outside him, but behind his eyes. A soft chime, like a game menu loading. A pale translucent interface materialized in his vision, clean text hovering over the real world, over the palm trees and the empty water. Survival system activated. Current location, uncharted island. Prepare to survive. He blinked. The text stayed. He blinked again. The text was still there. He looked at the empty horizon, then back at the interface. Somewhere on a sinking cruise ship, he'd watched people clutch life preservers and cry out for help. Watched the ocean take the deck furniture first and then everything else. He'd gone over the rail when the hull listed, hit the water, and swum until he couldn't, and then been carried the rest of the way. And now he was here, and there was a video game interface in his head, and the ocean behind him contained no trace of 300 people. He filed those observations away in the same part of his mind that had always been better at surviving than his life before this had required him to be. He focused on the interface. The system explained itself in plain terms. Survival actions would earn points. Points could be spent in a built-in shop on skills, knowledge, and equipment. Complete enough milestones, gain enough abilities, and the odds shifted in his favor. A game, suspended inside a real disaster. He didn't try to understand why. He pushed the interface to the edge of his vision and took stock of what he had. Waterproof watch, still running, folding knife in his pocket, a plastic water bottle jammed into his waistband from the sea itself. His phone was dead, the screen already fogging behind the cracked glass. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. He started walking the shoreline, barefoot, checking both directions. The jungle pressed up immediately behind the sand, dark and dense, full of bird calls he didn't recognize, and once, something larger that moved in the interior, and went quiet when he stopped walking. The beach curved into rocky headlands in both directions. No sign of the ship, no sign of any structure, no sign that human beings had ever stood on this particular stretch of coast. He noted it, set it aside. The system's first knowledge purchase was a basic survival package, barely 10 points, and the system credited him the 10 just for waking up and assessing his situation, as if it had been watching him take inventory and approved. The knowledge arrived not as a burst of sensation, but as a kind of settled certainty, the way you might suddenly recall something you always knew. He knew that the young green coconuts at the tree line held more water than brown ones. He knew that the plastic bottle could concentrate sunlight. He knew that the stream seeping from the rocks at the jungle edge was visible from here as a dark line through the pale sand. He found the coconuts in 30 meters. He found the stream 20 meters further. He harvested 2 coconuts, drank them leaning against a palm trunk, and filled the plastic bottle at the stream. Then he made fire. He fed it every few hours after that, the way you'd tend something alive, checking coals before he slept, stoking it immediately on waking. Palm frond smoke rose straight up in the still air, visible from a distance. If anyone was looking, they'd see it. No one came. He heard Alan before he saw her. The scream came from roughly 200 meters south, high, sharp, cut off halfway through. Chintan was moving before the sound finished, picking up the longest branch from his fuel pile as he went. She was backed against a palm tree, a coastal taipan coiled at her feet, its head raised and tracking. She held the broken handle of a travel suitcase out in front of her like a shield. She still had her sandals on, which meant the sea had been kinder to her than to him. The snake's head began to move. Chintan stepped in at an angle, brought the branch across in a hard sweep, and pinned the snake's neck to the sand. It writhed immediately, coiling up the stick, trying to wrench itself free. He leaned his weight into it, waited, and eventually, the coiling slowed. He backed off in careful steps, guiding the snake toward the undergrowth with slow lateral movements until it disappeared. She stood against the tree for a moment without speaking. Her knees had buckled slightly. She'd caught herself on the bark. Her name was Alan. She'd been on the same cruise ship, had come to in the water gripping a life preserver, had washed up somewhere along the beach, and walked for an hour looking for survivors and found nothing. Which was exactly what Chintan had found. She was scared in the way people get scared when the thing that frightened them has passed, and now there's nothing left to be brave against. A delayed trembling in the hands that she clearly didn't want him to see. He brought her back to the fire. She helped, once the shaking stopped. That was the thing about Aline that mattered immediately. She didn't sit and wait. She watched him, asked short questions, and started handling the tasks she could figure out from observation alone. He was weaving a fish trap from flexible vine lengths near the stream when she sat beside him, studied the pattern for 2 minutes without speaking, and then simply took over, her fingers moving precisely. She'd studied design at university, an unlikely survival credential that turned out to be exactly right. They didn't talk much that first day. They didn't need to. Food came quicker than he'd expected. He killed a sea snake near the stream that evening, roasted it over the fire, and watched Aline's expression move through several stages before settling on reluctant acceptance. She ate it. She didn't say it was good. She just ate it, which was the correct response. Crabs at low tide. 3 small fish from the trap overnight. By the second morning they were eating more than adequately, and Chintan had built a rough lean-to from palm fronds and bamboo with a sleeping platform raised off the damp ground. He used the system's shop while his hands worked, navigating notifications with the small mental flicker he was already learning to keep invisible. When Alan glanced up and caught him standing still with his eyes slightly unfocused, he jerked sideways, slapped at his neck, said there'd been a bug. She looked at him for a moment with her head tilted, then went back to knotting the vines. She thought he was resourceful and lucky, that his practical knowledge came from somewhere in his past, perhaps a camping background, perhaps careful reading. She was right about the knowledge. She just didn't know where it was actually coming from. That gap mattered. He planned to keep it. The breakdown came on the 4th night. They'd had a good day, the shelter reinforced with a second layer of fronds against coming rain, the fish trap repositioned where the current was stronger, a thick bamboo section repurposed as a water container. Chintan was sitting by the fire eating the last of a roasted crab when he noticed Aline had gone very still. She was hugging her knees, looking at nothing in particular, and tears were running down her face. She said she was sorry. Then she said what she'd actually been thinking since day one. That no plane had flown over, that no boat had passed, that the ship had taken 300 people down and they were the only 2 they'd seen on this beach, and she didn't understand how that was possible. She'd kept it down by staying busy, and now it wasn't staying down. Her voice climbed. Chintan listened through most of it, then the open-handed slap was quick, not hard, just enough to cut through the feedback loop she was caught in. She went very still. He told her, in a level voice, that they were alive. That rescue was only possible on days they were alive, and they'd been alive for 4 of them in a row, which was not nothing. He didn't promise her it would be fine. He told her that breaking down and then pulling herself back together was not weakness. It was exactly how surviving actually looked. She stared at him for a long time, then wiped her face with the back of her hand. She leaned against the shelter wall that night, and sometime around midnight her head came to rest against his shoulder, and he didn't move until morning. The boar appeared on the 6th day. Chintan heard it first, crashing in the undergrowth, erratic, the wrong rhythm for something healthy. He tracked the sound to a break between ferns and found the animal, a large wild boar with one foreleg dragging, damaged in some encounter he hadn't witnessed. It was rooting through a patch of vegetation at the jungle edge. Injured as it was, it still outweighed him by a factor that made the calculation complicated. He checked the system. No combat skills purchased. No hunting knowledge beyond the basics. The interface simply noted that taking a large animal was a high-value survival action, and left the decision to him. He spent most of his accumulated points on a throwing spear knowledge package, hardened 2 straight branches in the fire that evening, and went back out the next morning. Tracking the boar took 4 hours. The animal was moving faster than he'd expected from an injured one, and the jungle interior was harder going than the beach edge. Dense, humid, the ground uneven with exposed roots. He lost the trail twice, backtracked both times, and finally closed to 20 meters in a clearing where the boar had stopped at a shallow pool to drink. He threw the first spear at the shoulder. It hit, stuck, didn't drop the animal. The boar turned, found him instantly with small dark eyes, and charged. He had time to plant his feet and throw the second spear from close range, no technique in it, pure reflex, and the point went in at the neck. The animal dropped and its momentum carried it another meter, sliding into his legs and putting him flat on his back in the mud. He lay there for a moment staring at the canopy, while the system registered a significant points total. When he walked out of the jungle 2 hours later carrying as much dressed meat as he could manage, hands and forearms red, Alin looked at him and started laughing. She said he looked like something from a horror film. She said this while already moving toward him to help carry. They ate exceptionally well that night. The creature announced itself with sound. Chintan heard it from the shelter 3 nights later. A low resonance from the jungle interior. Nothing like the bird calls or the distant crashing of whatever large things moved in the deep undergrowth. He sat up in the dark and pulled up the system's wildlife data. What came back wasn't information. It was the same terse warning as before. Do not pursue large fauna until appropriate skills are acquired. He acquired the appropriate skills. He spent 2 days and most of his accumulated points on an animal taming package and a bonding seal. A system mechanic that explained itself after the knowledge settled. The seal created a permanent bond with a tamed animal, but only after the animal's resistance had been broken through a specific process. The knowledge was precise about this. First, reduce the animal's strength, then approach in the window of vulnerability. The method involved a small iridescent frog found near the stream, 3 of them, which he collected using a bark strip as a barrier because skin contact with this species was inadvisable. He extracted the compound carefully, diluted it, and laced a section of meat left on the trail where the sounds were coming from. He did this 2 nights running. On the morning of the 3rd day, he found the creature collapsed in a jungle clearing, and he stood at the edge of the undergrowth for a full minute before walking closer. It was enormous, bear-shaped in a loose sense, black and white marked, with teeth that no animal that size should have developed on a bamboo diet, and claws that suggested it had never eaten bamboo in its life. It was built to kill things larger than Chintan without particularly noticing them. And it was barely conscious, breathing in long, slow pulls, its massive sides rising and falling. He walked up to it, crouched. His heart was moving faster than he would have liked. He placed his hand on the animal's side, coarse fur, warm, the muscle beneath it dense, and activated the seal. The interface flickered, a bonding display appeared, a bar filling slowly, then it stabilized. The creature opened one eye, turned it toward him, did not move. 3 days later, it was following him along the beach at a loose 2-meter distance, stopping when he stopped, sitting when he sat. Aline watched it from the shelter entrance with her arms crossed. She told Chintan she was glad it walked rather than charged. Then she went inside and moved all the food to the back of the shelter. They called it Shanbai. He wasn't sure why the name stuck, it just did. The system rewarded infrastructure as generously as combat. That surprised him, though it shouldn't have. He discovered it by accident when he formed a rough clay water container. Not useful enough to hold water, but the system logged the attempt and credited him for it. He spent those points on ceramics knowledge, and the next batch was functional. Rough gray-brown pots that held water without cracking. More points. Then soap, from wood ash and the rendered fat of the boar. Simple and not pretty, and exactly what they needed. Points again. Aline had precise hands. She took to the pottery faster than he did, her spatial sense translating directly to the work. She built a small kiln at the stream bank while Chintan worked on paper, a process that took 3 failed batches before the 4th came out rough but writable, made from boiled bamboo fiber pressed flat and dried in the sun. He used it to map the coastline, marking resource locations in charcoal. Salt, from seawater in the pottery, slow boiling to evaporation. Alan ran the salt operation. Chintan let her. The sundial was her idea. She scratched the design in the sand first, explained it, and he nodded, and they built it from a flat stone and an iron-hard stick. They calibrated it to the midday sun and marked the hours, and the camp changed after that. Not physically, but it stopped feeling purely desperate. It had a schedule now. That mattered more than Chintan had expected. Glass took longer. A week of iteration on the clay furnace to get the fuel mix and temperature right. The volcanic sand from the northern section of the beach had the right silica content. The first pour came out full of bubbles and completely useless. The second was better. The third poured into a mold he'd pressed from clay. He shaped a lens before it cooled. Then he built the telescope. 2 lenses, a bamboo tube, the proportions drawn from a knowledge purchase he'd made, with points saved from the infrastructure push. He assembled it sitting on the beach with the afternoon light behind him, fitted the lenses, looked through it at the horizon. A ship. Moving along the far edge of visibility, slow and oddly shaped, not the flat silhouette of a modern vessel. Too far to make out fine details, but wrong in the particular way that something from a different era is wrong when you see it next to your expectations. He lowered the telescope and sat very still. Aylin asked what he saw. Aylin asked what he saw. He said he was looking at the waterline, some interesting rock formations. She accepted that. She went back to her work. He turned the telescope over in his hands and thought about what a ship that looked like that might be doing in waters that didn't appear on any chart, and what the people on it might want. The system had no information to offer on this subject. The island had kept quiet about its larger dangers so far, showing him only the manageable ones: the snake, the boar, the warnings about larger fauna. He had a feeling the ship on the horizon was a different category of problem. Whatever was coming, it wasn't coming today. He put the telescope away and went to help Aline with the evening fire. 3 days after Chintan spotted the ship, the boars found the camp. Not the injured animal he'd hunted. A full sounder of them, maybe 8, driving fast through the jungle edge in a noise like rolling thunder. He heard them coming about 40 seconds before they broke into the clearing. Long enough to get Aline pressed against the back of the shelter, not long enough for much else. Shanbai was already on its feet. The first boar hit the camp perimeter, and Shanbai met it head-on. No hesitation, no defensive posture, just a flat intercept charge that stopped the animal before it reached the fire. The collision was enormous, loud enough to feel in Chintan's chest. He threw a burning branch toward the tree line and shouted, and 2 of the sounder turned. The others didn't. One boar drove straight into Shanbai's ribs, another caught it from behind. Chintan threw the second branch, grabbed his spear, and drove it into the flank of the nearest animal. The sounder finally broke left, poured back into the undergrowth, some combination of fire and noise and confusion outweighing their momentum. The crashing faded. Shanbai was down, not dead, still breathing, sides heaving. But a tusk had caught it at the right shoulder, and the wound was deep enough to show tissue beneath the fur. Chintan crouched and pressed both palms flat against it, and Aline was beside him before he asked, tearing strips from the cleanest cloth in the shelter. They worked through most of the night. He cleaned the wound with salt solution and packed it with astringent bark from the foraging download. Shanbai lay completely still through all of it, which might have been the pain or might have been something else. He chose to believe it was something else. By morning, the bleeding had slowed. Aline set a piece of fish beside the animal's head, small and close, and Shanbai ate it without lifting its body. She sat back on her heels and exhaled. She told Chintan she hadn't expected to care this much about something that could flatten them both without trying. She said this sideways, as if half daring him to agree. He didn't answer. His hands were still unsteady, and he'd been awake for 22 hours, and he was looking at the healed edge of the wound with the particular attention of a person who's been genuinely scared and doesn't want to show it. The eagle came into his awareness during Shanbai's recovery. He'd been ranging further from camp while the beast healed, partly for food supply, partly because staying in the clearing all day put an edge on him. He pushed north along the coast past the volcanic sand deposits, into a section where the beach gave way to cliff face rising sharply from the water. The bird was perched on an outcrop 30 meters up, wingspan enormous, watching him with the evaluating attention of something deciding whether he was prey or simply too much trouble. He stood still and looked back at it. The taming knowledge from the system was a single purchase: sleep deprivation bonding, an old falconry approach. Keep the bird awake for a sustained period, remain present through all of it, and let exhaustion do what restraint alone cannot. He baited the cliff base with fish over 2 days. On the third attempt, hood down, a folded cloth improvised in camp, he got close enough. 4 days followed that he would not remember fondly. Broken sleep, a large irritated bird on a lashed wood perch, the cliff base as his workspace. On the second day, it bit through the edge of his left palm. He wrapped it with bark cloth and stayed. On the morning of the 5th day, the bonding interface appeared in his vision. The bird's head turned toward him. Its eyes, which had been flat and ferocious for 4 days, went to something quieter. Still, not tame in any soft sense, but aware of him in a different way than before. He named it Desert Eagle. Alan said this was the least imaginative name she'd ever heard, and then spent the following morning feeding it small pieces of fish from a cautious distance of 3 meters, which suggested she had opinions she wasn't fully living by. The first time the psychic link engaged, the bird's vision sliding into his own like a second window opening, it hit him with a disorientation he hadn't anticipated. Not his eyes, but the eagle's. The camp from 200 meters up, reduced to a curl of smoke and a clearing against an enormous expanse of green. He sat with it until the dizziness passed and learned to hold both images at once. From the air, the island was vast. Much vaster than the coastline walks had suggested. The beach camp was a thin scratch against interior that stretched for kilometers. Ridgelines, a volcanic cone in the far distance, river systems threading through dense canopy. At the island's northern edge, barely legible through the trees, something that looked like structures, built things, old. He cut the vision and sat for a while looking at the fire. The sky gave warning sounds before the aircraft appeared. A mechanical drone, wrong-pitched, coming from the south. He was at the fish traps when it reached him, and he looked up in time to see the biplane descending with dark smoke trailing from one side of its engine. It was fighting the descent, the pilot still working the controls, adjusting angle, trying to bring it level rather than nose first. It came down in the shallows 400 meters north, bounced hard, and dug into a sandbar offshore. The engine cut. Chintan was running before the splash settled. He waited the last stretch and reached the cockpit to find the canopy already shoved open and a woman pulling herself out onto the wing. Late 20s, leather flight jacket over a white shirt, goggles pushed up to her forehead. A cut above her left eye had run blood down that side of her face. She looked at him with the calm, measuring expression of someone who had decided to postpone panic to a later time. Her name was Jessica. She was a paleontologist and a pilot, and she'd been running an aerial survey route when the storm took her navigation. He helped her to shore, cleaned the head cut back at camp, fed her water and fish. She ate and looked around the clearing with the systematic interest of someone cataloging information. The kiln, the pottery stacked near the shelter, the telescope laid on a flat stone, Shanbai watching her from across the fire, and said it was an impressive operation for someone marooned for a few weeks. He said thank you. She asked what year it was. He told her. Something small and controlled moved across her face and stopped all her other expressions. She looked at him without speaking for a moment, then asked him to repeat it. He did. She was quiet. Alan took a step closer from the shelter entrance without meaning to. Jessica said in a careful and level voice that she couldn't have arrived where he was telling her she'd arrived. She'd left Honolulu on a survey flight, and she knew the date she'd departed, and she knew the year, and it was not the year he'd just given her. He asked what year she believed it was. She told him. 1927. The number sat between them. The fire crackled. Desert Eagle turned its head on its perch. Shanbai's slow breathing was the only other sound. Chintan looked at the biplane sitting offshore. Its fixed landing gear, the fabric-covered wings, the open cockpit he'd stood beside and registered without interrogating, and felt the weight of what he'd been avoiding since the telescope sighting. The ship that moved too slowly. The woman who'd landed in a machine from a century ago, the island that had dropped him on a beach with no debris, no survivors, no explanation. The island collected people out of time. It reached back along some thread he couldn't explain, and pulled them here from different years, and left them stranded with each other. He said he believed her, simply and without qualification. The look that crossed her face after that was something between relief and the edge of tears, and she was someone who didn't allow tears, so she pressed the heel of her hand against her good eye for a moment, and then asked for more water. Aline caught his eye over Jessica's shoulder. He gave her the smallest possible head shake. Later. Not now. The system awarded him points for establishing contact with a new survivor. He accepted them. It felt inadequate to the scale of what he'd just understood. Jessica integrated herself faster than carefully. She knew biology, chemistry, and enough materials science from her paleontology fieldwork to be genuinely useful before her second morning at camp. She looked at Chintan's soap operation and suggested 3 amendments that increased the yield significantly. She looked at his gunpowder experiments, inconsistent and frustrating, still nowhere near reliable, and asked precise questions about his sulfur sourcing. He told her, volcanic deposits, a day's walk into the interior. She said she'd surveyed part of the island from the air. Between the coast and the volcano, there was a low basin she'd noted from above. The fog pattern over it was unusual. She couldn't say exactly what it was from altitude, but she'd circled wide of it on instinct. They went to the volcano 10 days after her crash, when the gunpowder work had stalled and better sulfur was the only path forward. All three of them, Shanbai leading on the trail ahead, Desert Eagle ranging overhead. Into the interior, through stands of bamboo and across 2 river crossings, until the jungle thinned into something different. The swamp basin opened in the early afternoon, a dark, flat spread of water and mud, trees around it draped with mist that sat absolutely still, no breeze moving it, no sun burning it off. The smell was faint, organic, slightly sweet, not unpleasant. Jessica stopped. She said quietly, to put out the torch. He looked at her. She said again, please extinguish the torch immediately and don't strike anything. He dropped it into the mud and ground it under his boot heel. Around them the mist lay undisturbed. She explained in a low voice, not water vapor. The density and the smell were consistent with methane accumulating from decomposition in a sealed basin. Methane in sufficient concentration required almost nothing. A spark, a struck flint, a torch a fraction too close, to move from invisible to catastrophic. They backed out along the firm ground at the swamp's edge, heel to toe, 30 careful meters, before anyone spoke at normal volume. Alan said she was going to make a deliberate choice not to think about what would have happened if they'd arrived 5 minutes faster. Jessica said that sounded like wisdom. The route around the basin added 2 hours. When they reached the volcano's lower slope and Chintan broke open a sulfur deposit with his spear butt, the yellow mineral underneath was insultingly abundant. Jessica collected it with the careful movements of someone making conscious decisions about risk after a difficult week. On the walk back, she revised his gunpowder formulation, precisely and from first principles. He listened and adjusted the ratios in his head. The system noted the knowledge exchange and awarded points. He'd had a lit torch in his hand 30 meters from a methane swamp. He kept that calculation to himself. Desert Eagle found the girl before Chintan would have. He was at camp adjusting the gunpowder mixture when the psychic link opened without him reaching for it. The bird had decided something was worth sending. A bird's-eye view, a river inlet a few kilometers north, mangroves dense on both banks, and a figure moving through shallow water with urgency, looking back over one shoulder. Something in the undergrowth was keeping pace with her. He broke the vision and signaled to Alan and Jessica and was moving before he'd finished explaining. The eagle was still circling tight overhead when the three of them reached the inlet, a pinpoint marking the location below, and the sound of pursuit through the mangroves was still audible from the far bank. She broke from the trees and stopped when she saw them. Tall, lean, wrapped cloth and leather, practical and worn. A short hafted blade across her back. Blood on her hands that was not hers, and a bruise forming along her jaw. She'd been fighting before she ran. She assessed the three of them with fast, intelligent eyes, and said something in a language none of them recognized. She said it louder. Chintan raised his open palm toward her. She looked at Shanbai standing behind him, and whatever threat calculation she'd been running, paused and restarted with different inputs. She held up 3 fingers, touched her blade, glanced at the mangrove line. 3 pursuers still in the undergrowth. Jessica already had the sidearm out. Aylin had stepped behind Shanbai, shoulder against its flank, without being asked. Chintan turned toward the mangroves and raised his spear. The scouts who emerged were lightly armed, reconnaissance rather than raiding strength. They stopped when they saw what was waiting. The standoff lasted maybe 15 seconds before one of them decided the numbers were wrong, and they pulled back into the undergrowth and were gone. The girl let out a breath that had been held a long time. Her name, as best as Chintan could render it, was Hai. Over the next hour, through gestures and mimicry and a patience he wouldn't have had in his old life, the picture assembled itself. A tribe, inland, her people. She pressed her fist against her stomach and held it, hungry. She touched her own eye and drew her fingers down her face. Grief. Many people. A long time without enough food. Displaced, he suspected. As Jessica was displaced. as the ship on the horizon carried people displaced. She led them to her tribe the following morning. The Lao were camped in a sheltered valley 2 kilometers inland, maybe 60 people in lean-tos of branches and leaves that had been standing for a long time based on how they'd settled into the ground. They were thin. Not the mild thinness of people watching their diet, the particular leanness of people who had been genuinely short of calories for months, the kind that shows in the face and in the way people move, conserving effort without thinking about it. The elder came forward when Hai led them into the camp, a man old enough that age had compressed him slightly, bearing still straight, eyes sharp. He looked at Chintan for a long time. Then he spoke, and an older man behind him translated haltingly into something closer to a language Chintan could partially parse. A colonial-era pidgin English, fragments he could assemble into meaning. The elder said their people had come from elsewhere and found themselves here, and the island had taken many of them. The last winter had taken more. They had eaten what the forest gave them, but the forest near their camp was depleted, and they were now eating things that kept them alive without keeping them well. Chintan looked around the camp. He saw a woman carefully rationing something into equal portions no larger than his fist. Children sitting very still, which children only do when they've learned that movement costs calories they don't have. He found the taro that afternoon. Not luck. The foraging download had told him exactly what taro looked like and where it preferred to grow, and the valley floor had the right combination of damp and shade. He brought Hai to the stand of broad-leafed plants and pointed. She looked at them and said something emphatic and negative, accompanied by a gesture that clearly meant poisonous or bad. He nodded. He understood. Raw taro was inedible. The crystals in it would put a person in agony. He mimed the cooking process. Long boiling, changed water, long boiling again. He tried to show this twice with gestures and gave up and just made it, spending 3 hours by a fire building a batch of properly cooked taro from scratch, while a small audience of increasingly curious tribe members watched from a cautious distance. He handed the first piece to Hai. She looked at it, looked at him, ate it. Her expression went through several stages. Then she turned and called to the elder. What came after was the most careful, methodical distribution of food Chintan had ever watched. The elder organized it without any visible instruction. Sections, portions, most of the initial batch going to the children, and the oldest without discussion. People ate in near silence, which was not the silence of distrust but of concentration, of something that matters being given its proper attention. An older woman, somewhere behind the elder, was crying quietly. Chintan looked away and helped Alan start the next batch. The Lao tribe's elder came to Chintan the morning after the taro feeding and made his meaning clear through a sequence of gestures that needed no interpreter. More, please. If possible. We are many, and the forest here is not enough. He brought forward a young woman with hollow cheeks, who couldn't have been more than 14, and he looked at Chintan and waited. Chintan looked at the taro stand. The valley held more than the initial harvest he'd taken. He walked back to it with 3 tribe members and spent the morning showing them the preparation. Which leaves, how to dig without damaging the root system, how to identify which plants were mature. The system gave him points for agricultural knowledge sharing, which felt like a category it hadn't known to create before. By the second day he was something else in the tribe's estimation. He'd seen it shift during the distribution, the elders' eyes, the way the younger warriors positioned themselves. He brought glass-made fire by holding a lens to tinder in the village center that evening, and the murmur that moved through the watching crowd was the same sound in every language. He let it land. He didn't explain it. The system had not told him to perform. It was his idea. The knowledge he had came from somewhere none of these people could access. The interface none of them could see. The running tally of points and skills and downloads that existed in his head and nowhere else. To a tribe already half convinced of the supernatural, the right sequence of things looked like precisely what they decided it was. He held the lens steady until the tinder smoked, and the elder touched his fist to his chest and spoke, and the haltingly English-speaking older man translated. The chief said Chintan was someone the island had sent. Hai stood at the edge of the watching group. She was watching Chintan's face with the expression of someone who is simultaneously moved and suspicious, and he respected her for both. Kata made his challenge on the 3rd day. He was the tribe's most accomplished warrior, visible in the way he occupied space, the way other men oriented toward him in discussion. He'd been quiet during the taro harvest and the fire demonstration, watching from a deliberate distance. On the third morning, he stepped into the cleared center of the camp and spoke at length, and the translator relayed the essentials, that the tribe did not follow powerful figures on the basis of tricks. That food came from the earth, not from men. That if this outsider had real power, the warrior standing here was prepared to test it directly. He was not aggressive in tone, he was worse, entirely calm. Chintan looked at him for a moment and thought about what he had available. He'd brought a small clay vial from camp, a diluted compound from the same frog species he'd used on Shanbai, reduced to a concentration that the system's knowledge told him was temporary in effect and not permanently dangerous to a healthy adult. He'd prepared it as a contingency, not knowing specifically why. He'd ground the reduction into a thin paste and carried it in a bark-sealed container, the way a person carries something they might need without being certain. He crouched by the fire and spent 3 minutes heating stones, moving them, arranging a small ceremony's worth of gestures that looked deliberate and meant nothing except time. While he worked, he asked Hai quietly, through the translator, for something of Kata's, a personal object, anything recently handled. A leather cord came back. Kata had been wearing it at his wrist. He laced the compound onto a section of it, barely a trace, and held it to the fire briefly while he went through more meaningless theater. He called Kata forward and returned it, making a production of tying it back at the man's wrist himself, hands steady, face calm. He counted slowly in his head. He got to 43 before Kata, who had been standing with his arms crossed and his expression composed, blinked slowly and went very still. His arms dropped. His legs didn't exactly buckle, he stayed upright, but nothing was moving quite right, the compound working through the skin into muscle coordination. He stood frozen, alert, aware, furious, but not moving. Chintan waited a measured interval, then looked at the elder and said through the translator, "The warrior was completely fine, he was safe, and in a few minutes everything would return to normal." He said it gently, clearly. He said the point was not to humiliate. He held Kata's eyes while he said it. 15 minutes later, Kata could move again. He stood in the center of the camp while the sensation returned to his limbs, and the look he gave Chintan was complicated. Not broken pride exactly, but the recalibration of a precise man who has received accurate information. Over the following days, he would become one of the most useful members of the combined operation. He never mentioned the paralysis. He never fully trusted Chintan's explanations, which was also reasonable. The forge came from necessity. He'd been working in bamboo and stone and leather and clay, and those materials had taken them far. But the volcano's ore deposits, iron-bearing rock in the lower slopes, sulfur abundant, quartz for flux, put the next level within reach once the system provided the metallurgy knowledge. It was expensive, the heaviest points purchase he'd made so far. He spent a full day's earnings doing nothing else, navigating the shop carefully, cross-referencing what the knowledge cost against what the capability would unlock. He bought it in stages, smelting first, then forging, then tempering. Each stage settled into him like the others, and each stage transformed what he could build. The first forge was clay-walled, bellows made from animal hide fitted to a bamboo nozzle, fuel a mix of wood charcoal and the powdered ore packed into clay crucibles. The tribal men who helped build it were practical and competent. The Lao were not primitive. They were simply displaced and malnourished, and fed and purposeful they proved fast learners. One of them, a compact older man who'd been a blacksmith's helper in his own era, understood what the forge was for before Chintan finished explaining it. The first iron pieces were rough and porous. The second batch was better. By the fourth day of operation they had functional blades, machete weight, useful but not elegant. And by the second week, they had something approaching steel through a charcoal saturation process that the system had outlined in precise terms. The gunpowder, with Jessica's reformulated ratios, finally worked reliably. He cast it into clay containers with fuse lengths he'd standardized through trial, sized them for throwing distance, tested 3 against a boulder at the valley edge, and watched the rock face crack in 3 places and come apart in 1. Jessica said she took back what she'd thought about the childishness of his bomb-making interest. He told her she was very generous. She said the shrapnel pattern was actually quite elegant if you thought about it as a materials science problem, which he had not previously considered as a compliment. The ship he'd spotted through the telescope had a name. He learned it from the Lao. The translator worked through what the elder told him carefully. Raiders who came from the sea in a vessel with a dark sail, who took captives for labor, who spoke of something they were looking for in the island's interior. A source of water, the old man said, or perhaps something older than that. They called it different things in different moods. They were led by a captain, whose name the translator rendered as Swang Sen, a man the elder described as organized, patient, and very capable of cruelty. 6 members of the tribe were being held at the raider camp, 3 days' walk along the northern coast. One of them was the elder's son. The elder told Chintan he wasn't asking for help. He said this clearly. He said his tribe was grateful for the food and for the shelter they'd been offered. He would not add an impossible request to that debt. He said it looking at the floor of his lean-to, and Chintan watched the calculation happen on the elder's face, the measuring of hope against the discipline that comes from too many hopes that didn't survive contact with reality. Chintan told him they'd bring his son back. He scouted through Desert Eagle's eyes first. 2 days of wide overflights, the bird ranging north while Chintan sat still at camp with his eyes tracking something no one else could see. Jessica noticed and asked about it. He gave a vague answer about intuition, and she looked at him the way she sometimes did, a particular quality of attention that suggested she was filing something away for later examination. The raider camp was on a coastal shelf north of a river mouth, a natural harbor, the ship moored at a timber dock, tents, and a rough stockade structure. Through the bird's vision, he counted 23 men. The 6 captives were held in the stockade, visible when the gates opened for feeding. Guards in 2-man rotations. The captain's tent was the largest, set back against the cliff face. He planned for a week. The scheme required 2 simultaneous things: someone to pull Swangsen's attention north along the coast, and someone else to reach the stockade from the south in the confusion. The attention pull required noise, fire, apparent force. He was the one who could produce all of those things. He was also the one least useful in a close-quarters extraction, because Kata and Hai and 2 other warriors would be faster and quieter in that terrain than he would. He would go north. They would go south. He would make enough noise for twice the number of people he was. Jessica pointed out that this plan required him to be alone, at a cliff edge he'd identified from the air as the only escape route, with 20 men who'd quickly realized they'd been used as a distraction. She made this observation factually, without emphasis. He said that was correct. She said something under her breath in English that he decided not to ask her to repeat. The bombs landed well. He timed the first one to the guard's rotation change, a gap of roughly 40 seconds that the Eagle had shown him twice and confirmed the third time. The explosion hit the north edge of the camp when most of the men were at the dock or moving between posts, and the effect was substantially larger than he'd calculated. The sulfur deposit he'd packed as secondary fill went up with a force that knocked 3 men off their feet and started a fire in the nearest tent. He threw the second one as the shouting started and the men turned north. He was already running. The cliff was 200 meters, uphill, over broken terrain he'd memorized through the Eagle's eyes, from a bird's perspective, and was now navigating at ground level in bad light and with his lungs burning. He heard the pursuit behind him, more men than he'd estimated, faster than he'd planned for, and he revised the calculation while running, and the revised calculation was not comfortable. The edge came up fast. Below it, 30 meters of rock face, then the ocean. He pulled the hang glider from where he'd stashed it. 3 hours of construction the previous evening, bamboo spars lashed into a crossframe, the lightest salvaged canvas from Jessica's plane stretched and tied at the angles the system's physics knowledge specified. He hadn't tested it. There'd been no opportunity to test it without revealing it to anyone watching. He ran toward the edge and jumped. The drop happened faster than the system's knowledge had prepared him for, the glider catching air with a violence that pulled his arms nearly out of alignment, tilting him sideways before the frame stabilized. He yanked his weight right and the nose came up, and for approximately 4 seconds he was not falling, he was actually flying, the cliff face moving past him in a blur, and the ocean spreading out ahead. Then the updraft cut, and he dropped the last 8 meters into the water, went in badly, came up coughing. He surfaced 30 meters from the cliff base, and treaded water and looked up. The edge was empty. The pursuit had stopped where the ground ran out. He floated on his back for a while, arms out, looking at the sky. Hai reached the stockade before the camp's attention fully realigned. The prisoners were out and moving south before anyone connected the explosion with the extraction. They met at the rendezvous camp that night, 8 kilometers inland from the coast. The elder's son walked in with Hai's arm steadying him. Thin, moving carefully, but walking. The elder didn't make a sound when he saw him. He crossed the camp and put both hands on the young man's face and held it, and stood there for a long time. Aline had waited at camp. When Chintan arrived, still wet, bruised across his left shoulder from the glider impact, she looked him over once from head to boot, and then walked forward and held on to him with a force that was disproportionate to her size. He said he was fine. She said she knew that, which was why she'd stopped worrying and started being furious, and if he could feel the difference in the grip that was intentional. Jessica watched from the fire with an expression she took particular care to keep neutral. The relocation happened over 3 days. Moving 60 people and their remaining supplies south to Chintan's section of coast was a logistics problem he solved largely by subdividing it. Kata managed the warriors' movement, Hai handled the children and the weakest adults, and Jessica organized the supply transport with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd coordinated aerial survey expeditions. The elder walked under his own power without assistance, which was clearly important to him, so no one offered any. The combined camp was 8 times the size of what Chintan had managed alone with Aline. He watched the Lao people absorb its infrastructure, the kiln, the forge, the shelters, the salt operation, with the particular attention of people who've been improvising for a long time and recognize good improvisation when they see it. Within a week, the forge was operating 12 hours a day. Charcoal production expanded to fuel it. The matchmaking workshop that Aline and Jessica had developed, sulfur tips on split bamboo, went into near-industrial output. They built proper houses next, lime mortar and timber, with the kiln's output repurposed for brick pressing. The structures were serviceable and warm and wouldn't come apart in a coastal storm, and the tribe's elder walked through the first completed one and said something that the translator rendered, with some hesitation, as, "This is the kind of thing we were trying to build in our own time, and we hadn't managed it." Chintan didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which was the right response. The tribal men took to the forge work with an aptitude that suggested generations of metalworking knowledge somewhere in their lineage. The smith's helper Chintan had identified early became the forge's primary operator within 2 weeks, outpacing Chintan's own technique in the practical execution of what the system's knowledge had provided theoretically. Chintan was relieved. He hadn't particularly enjoyed the detailed forge work. He was better at designing systems than operating them. The proto-firearms came last. Flintlock mechanism principles from the system's shop, built by the smith's helper with modifications that reflected his own judgment. Slow and imperfect but functional at close range. Kata test-fired the first one, examined it, fired it twice more, and handed it back without comment. His expression had been doing more work than his words for weeks. The duel was Chintan's fault, insofar as he'd accepted a challenge he hadn't understood. Hai had been his ally for long enough that he read her signals reasonably well by this point. When she wanted him to follow her, when she wanted to be left alone, when she was displeased. He did not read the signal that said, "If you agree to this formal contest with me in front of the full assembly of the Lao people, you are agreeing to something considerably larger than what you think you're agreeing to." She challenged him to a sparring match in the camp center, which he accepted as straightforwardly as it was offered. He was not as fast or as technically trained as she was, and she took his sparring weapons from him twice, and once put him on his back with a sweep he didn't anticipate. He was genuinely trying. She was better. He acknowledged this cleanly, which seemed to be the expected response. The elder stood and spoke at some length. The translator relayed, "By the customs of the Lao, a formal combat in front of the assembly, willingly entered, not yielded in contempt but concluded with honor, constituted the terms of a marriage proposal." As the initiating party, Hai had asked. As the party who completed the contest with honor, Chintan had accepted. He stood in the center of the camp and processed this. Hai, to her credit, was not pretending she hadn't known. She wasn't quite looking at him, but she was not pretending. She stood with her hands at her sides and the expression of someone who'd done a calculated thing and was now waiting to see if the calculation held. Across the camp, Alan's face had gone completely neutral, which was the precise opposite of her natural expression, and meant something extremely specific. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Alan spoke before Chintan could. She walked to the center and spoke to the translator in a measured voice, and the translator took it to the elder with a visible uncertainty about the cultural weight of what he was carrying. She proposed a modification to the custom, a period of consideration, to be set by the elder, during which the parties demonstrated fitness to build a life together through continued work and alliance. This was, she explained through the translator, a custom from her own people that she hoped the Lao might honor as a gesture of the friendship between them. It was not a custom from her own people. It was something she'd invented in the previous 45 seconds. The elder listened. He looked at Hai. He looked at Chintan. He looked at Aline, who held his gaze with complete composure. He said the proposal was acceptable. The period of consideration would be 1 full season. Hai said nothing. She walked back to her position and resumed the neutral expression she defaulted to when she was actively deciding not to react. Chintan looked at Aline and tried to communicate gratitude without using his face in any way that was visible to either Hai or Jessica. Aline looked straight past him at a point on the horizon, which was also a kind of answer. Winter announced itself through the birds first. 3 mornings running, Desert Eagle stayed on its perch past full daylight, reluctant to climb into cold air that was visibly affecting its behavior in ways Chintan hadn't seen before. On the 4th morning he woke to find frost on the exterior of his shelter wall, a thin gray rime across the bamboo that caught the early light like ground glass. He pressed his finger to it. Gone in a second. But it had been there. He called a fuel meeting before breakfast. The combined camp ran on charcoal. The forge consumed it at a rate the original small-scale operation had never needed to plan for, and the lime kiln added a second furnace that needed constant feeding. Through the warm months they'd kept pace through volume alone. More cutters, more kilns, more output. The calculation changed in winter. The Lao people hadn't been in a cold season on this island before. They didn't have layered clothing or insulated structures. The houses Chintan had built with lime mortar were solid, but warmth inside them required fire, and fire required fuel, and fuel required labor in weather that made outdoor labor both harder and more urgent. He ran the numbers in his head. They needed to triple production before the temperature dropped further, and they needed to do it now, in the same week the cold had begun, rather than in 3 weeks when the gap would have become critical. Kata organized the cutting teams. He did it without being asked. Heard Chintan lay out the problem in the morning meeting, made eye contact with 2 of the senior tribal men, and the 3 of them were gone before the meeting finished. Hai managed the distribution of spare clothing, fabric from Jessica's salvaged cargo, woven cloth the Lao women had been producing at the loom Alan had built from system knowledge patterns, anything with thickness redistributed toward the oldest and the youngest first. Jessica made a clay heating element that fit inside the lime mortar house walls, a ceramic tube that caught and held warmth from a small fire in a way that multiplied the heat without multiplying the fuel use. She built 3 working prototypes in a day and then sat Aline down and explained the principle, and Aline built 4 more that were slightly better than the originals, because her spatial sense caught a flaw in the channel geometry that Jessica had missed, and she fixed it without mentioning she was fixing it. Chintan saw this happen. He said nothing. He filed it alongside the 12 other moments from the last weeks that told him who these people were and what they were becoming together. The cold came harder on the 8th day. The temperature dropped overnight. A genuine plunge, not the gradual adjustment of early autumn but something sudden, as if the island had decided to demonstrate what it was capable of. Ice edged the water containers by morning. The stream near camp ran dark and fast, between banks that had gone rigid. 3 of the older tribe members were sick by the afternoon, the kind of sick that comes from bodies not prepared for a new climate fighting the adjustment hard. Aline ran the medical work. She had been building a pharmacopoeia for weeks, dried herbs cataloged by system download into treatments, bark preparations for fever, a willow-derived compound that she brewed over low heat and administered carefully by weight. She'd learned enough chemistry from Jessica to be precise about concentrations rather than approximate. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and when the oldest woman's fever broke near midnight, she sat back against the wall and closed her eyes, and didn't move for several minutes. Chintan put a bowl of food beside her. She ate it without opening her eyes. He told her she'd done well today. She said she'd done adequately, and that there was a difference, and that she was going to sleep now and they could discuss the difference tomorrow. He let her sleep. The wolves came to the camp edge on the 12th day of winter. Not in numbers, not at first. A scout, probably, one large gray shape at the tree line in the early evening, visible for 30 seconds against the snow-dusted undergrowth before it turned and was gone. Chintan saw it through the eagle's eyes and confirmed it on foot, finding the track in a patch of mud that the freeze hadn't reached yet, a paw print wider than his palm, deep pressed, from an animal that was not moving carefully because it was afraid. He told the camp calmly and organized a watch rotation that night. Nothing came near the fires. The second night, the pack itself spoke. Not near, a kilometer away at least, in the dark interior, but not uncertain either. The sound carried through the still cold air and reached every corner of the camp, and the children went quiet without being told to, the way children go quiet when they understand something without needing it explained. Shanbai stood at the south perimeter and did not sit down again for the rest of the night. Desert Eagle was inside the forge building, which was warmer, and Chintan didn't call it out. He needed the eagle's eyes sharp in the morning. The third night was silent. That was worse. Kata told him in the morning that silence meant approach. That in his tribe's experience with predators in their own time and place, the moment the sounds stopped was the moment you checked your weapons. He said this without drama, the way a person reports weather conditions. Chintan checked the weapons. The flintlock pieces were loaded and distributed. Jessica and Hai each carried one. Kata and 2 warriors carried a second and third, the remaining pieces in a rack at the camp's central post. The forged blades were at every station. The bombs, he had 12 remaining, were in a clay-sealed cache near the south perimeter, accessible in under a minute. He walked the perimeter with Hai that evening, checking the fire stations. The camp's outer ring of fires had been burning continuously for 3 days, consuming their charcoal surplus faster than he wanted, but the alternative was leaving gaps in the light. She stopped at the south perimeter post and stood still for a moment. He stopped too, listened. Nothing moved in the tree line. The snow had thickened on the ground during the day, and it lay undisturbed between the camp edge and the first row of trees, white and flat and unmarked. He was looking at it, following the line with his eyes, when he noticed the shape in the undergrowth 30 meters out. Not moving, just present, darker than the shadow it sat in, eyes catching the fire's light in 2 faint points. Then a second pair of eyes. Then a third, to the left. Hai had already reached back for her blade. Chintan reached for the signal whistle. 3 sharp notes, the agreed alarm, and brought it to his mouth. The howl that rose from the tree line at that moment was close enough to feel. He blew the whistle 3 times and shouted, and the camp behind him went from quiet to motion, the way a prepared camp does. Fast, purposeful, everyone moving to their designated position because they'd been told what that position was and had chosen to listen. He heard Kata calling orders on the north side, heard Jessica's voice sharp and carrying from the forge, heard the fire station stoke up. He faced the tree line with Hai's shoulder against his, the darkness full of movement now, shapes resolving from shadow into specific, enormous, hungry things. And the pack came forward out of the trees as one.